Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate this opportunity. It's really an honor to be part of the community here. And I think it was really good that this book published in Routledge Studies in Ecological Economics, and to be in the fine company of my teachers like Martha Pavel and Rainer Manstaden, who actually published book number 5, if you look at, in this philosophy of ecology and economics. And mine is 27, so I'm really excited about this, to continue that stream. And of course, it's been not just myself, there's been over the years a long series of collaborators that I've worked with in Georgia Tech, as well as National Center for Atmospheric Research and here at UVM, with Chris Koliba here at UVM, at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. I got a chance to work with Michael Grant, who was really, it was a dream come true to work with him, because he was the one who really started working on the drought-induced changes in Africa and the Sahel region. And that was one of the reasons that I really got into the climate change adaptation issues, myself coming from South Asia. We started to see that as we were moving along. So there is really a strong motivation that drives me, because I've been interested in international development issues since the 90s, and how these different policy at the global scale affects those. Those were have been a running theme throughout some of the papers that have come out, and this book is my aim at really trying to simplify some of the technical languages that was in their paper, but I don't know whether I was successful or not, and it probably will be a continuous battle to come. But so here, I want to have more discussion as opposed to an hour-long talk. I'm just going to be presenting the few themes and some of the challenges that we face with respect to international climate policy. And I'll start with this, the challenges that back in the 90s, when Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change started to think about some international climate policy interventions, they came up with these different scenarios, which were all the way from these, the red scenario line represents here A1F1 scenario, that's a fossil fuel intensive scenario. And on the other hand, they had these B2 models, which were like B1, B2 models, which are these blue scenarios. There was this lack of understanding about how the economic world would unfold in the 21st century, because that could have in turn feedback effect on what would be the ultimate greenhouse gas emissions, and that could in turn drive the climate policy, and the climate system. So now we have about 20 years of data to look at it, that actually where we stand since we started to talk about international climate policy mechanisms. And this black dotted line represents the observed data. And of course, you see that this line only goes down when there are recessions. You can exactly see the recessions happening. But otherwise, when we are not in recessionary periods, this line is very closely tracking this red line, which is the A1F1 scenario. So A1F1 scenario means that we are essentially looking at about 4 degree to 6 degree centigrade world by the end of this century. I'll just present a little bit more about that. But in this larger discussion, since 90s, there have been this challenge, like what kind of international policy mechanisms do we need to adopt to deal with this challenge of climate policy at the global scale? So, of course, many of you know the Kyoto, and I go in great length explaining the Kyoto mechanisms. Those were so-called like the flexibility mechanisms, and they had some kind of a top-down binding requirement for this Annex 1 industrialized countries that they should reduce about 5.2% emissions below 1990 levels, what I call like the grandfathering. And the grandfathering is that the countries which are emitting more can still emit more, but only 5% below the 1990 levels by 2012. So that was their kind of the grandfathering approach. And you would know, like for example, Canadians committed to the Kyoto, and then they bailed out because their actual emissions were about 80% above the 1990 levels. There were some countries which did not even join the Kyoto, like United States, which was major kind of contributor, about 20% of the global greenhouse gas emissions from US. And also then increasingly developing countries like China and Brazil, they were not also part of it, of the treaty. And there was a lot of discussion about other possible mechanisms that then could be carried over in post-2012 period. And of course, in the international relations theory, typically there is a lot of path dependency in the international relations. And it is expected that grandfathering would continue in the post-2012 period. And as I sent around that Doha blog, essentially the Doha negotiations, right now the understanding is that we will continue to have some of these clean development mechanisms, some of the flexibility mechanisms that were discussed under the Kyoto Protocol. And right now the hope is that by 2015, countries would agree to some kind of a pledge and review system, and the treaty would take effect in 2020. So that has raised the concerns that it might be actually too late to contain, to arrive at 2 degrees centigrade target that was set up not in exactly 2 degrees centigrade words, but in, that was the Rio agenda, and that was informally agreed upon target, but that has been, definitely we will be not able to meet that 2 degrees centigrade goal unless we do reverse engineering through some kind of like sequestration of the carbon dioxide emissions through massive geoengineering technologies, which might be very, very costlier. So in the broader scale, the discussion has been that, whether grandfathering will continue or not in the post-Kyoto Treaty, post-2012 world. But what we are looking at increasingly is that we have moved from grandfathering to bottom-up national commitments for that post-2020 World Treaty. So in the between 2012 and 2020, we would likely to be like a continuation of the grandfathering without any binding commitments and goals, but post-2020 treaty, that will be for the period of 2020 to 2050, for about a 30-year time horizon. It's going to be more like, it's looking like more or less bottom-up national commitments, where each country would make a pledge, and then there are no binding enforcements on them. So I'll come back to this, and the implications of that is that, so this was a Sturman's model from MIT group, where they have, I have also findings from the large-scale GCMs that given the time, I don't want to get into all the nitty-gritty details. So just, I want to present the big picture here. The big picture is that under the current pledges, this is the business as usual scenario that's looking at. So, I mean, that's the F1 scenario. And with the confirmed proposals, that the pledges that have been made so far, the only difference would be made, which is the difference between these two curves here. So the blue proposal, which is like essentially, in terms of the temperature, it translates just a lowering from 5 degrees Celsius, 5 degrees world to about 4 degree world. So even the current pledges would mean that we would be arriving at a mean of 4 degrees centigrade plus minus. You know, there is a lot of uncertainty around that, and we can get into the GCMs, different GCMs have different projections and different uncertainty intervals. But more or less the consensus is that they agree that the current pledges would have a mean temperature rise of about 4 degrees centigrade. And when we start looking at the precipitation impacts, like say the floods and droughts that would ensue from those atmospheric changes, we're looking at massive amount of floods and droughts. Like for example, one of the studies that came out recently in Science compared that the drought that US has experienced in the last 10 years, that would be in scale 10 times smaller than what the level of drought that would be experienced in US Southwest from the period 28 to 2100. So the level of drought would, if you can imagine, 10 times larger drought happening, the precipitation changes are still not captured in this particular model, but there is a lot of research going on about that at this point of time. So there are some potential proposals, like there are the Brazilian proposal and some of these other proposals that I want to talk about that are still on the table, and especially the countries like that represent the so-called like the victims in the international climate policy world are these AOSIS, the Alliance of Island States. Alliance of Island States have essentially, though their countries would disappear from the planet, essentially like countries like Maldives, their foreign minister held an underwater press conference just to signify what they are going to go through. But if you look at the Caribbean countries and some of these other like small island development states, the SIDS countries, their life is very much threatened. They might have to either move in their island to higher plains, with like any place which is about 5 feet and above, but 3 to 5 feet is looking very, very likely sea level rise. So 3 to 5 feet means that like New York, major parts of New York, Florida, and other coastal communities would be underwater. If you look at where the human population is, the population density, I don't want to get into all the details, but about 40–50% of the human population at the global scale lives in the coastal areas, and they would be affected just by the sea level rise. But this is a slow onset event. There would be also sudden onset events like, say, storm surges, hurricanes, and all that, and I've done some work in that area, and I don't have the time to get into the details. But you would see that, so we are really between grandfathering and bottom-up national commitments. But there are these countries like Alliance of Island States, as well as developing countries, have been arguing that we need to have more like per capita based targets. That should be part of this post-2020 treaty. And that's where at this point there is a lot of debate that is happening, where the developing countries are arguing that we need to have a shift from grandfathering or bottom-up national commitments to some kind of per capita or contraction or convergence-based approaches with a top-down binding resolution and or a treaty. On the other hand, the countries which are high emitters, especially the industrialized countries, their position has moved more and more towards bottom-up, non-binding kind of approaches, or even bottom-up national commitments. Some countries have agreed upon, but these are just pledges. There is no binding nature of that. So I would say, like, there are some ideas, like, for example, climate Marshall plans have been proposed. There's also like these human development goals, but of course you know that like the Johannesburg Plan of Action miserably failed. The Rio 2012 conference last year was more or less a failure. There was no significant new commitment that was made. So all of these kind of approaches are good rhetoric, but they have not been able to, they're not going to be able to result in any meaningful international climate policy action. So on the other hand, if you look at these top-down, non-binding kind of approaches that some of the countries are also proposing, and in my book I have all the citations for different approaches, and different countries were kind of backing up these different proposals. But again, like for example, agreed domestic carbon taxes, or these other kinds of like a north-south dialogue, because there are a lot of equity issues between the developed world and the developing countries about the timing of those regulations, when would they take place, and which sectors would be affected, because we're talking about practically almost every sector in the modern economy that ranges from economy, the energy systems to forest systems to agriculture systems. And at the same time, there are these people who are arguing for more like graduation and deepening kind of approaches, where certain countries would be allowed to develop, especially the developing countries, and once they have attained certain level of development, then they will be able to then they would be asked to come into the treaty, come and become part of the treaty, let's say by 2030, 2035. So say, like a classical example is the case of India, where Indians can increase their per capita income up to about $5,000, and then they would become part of the international treaty like around 2035 or so. So if we look at the position of these, like what are the sources of failure? Like why did we in the last 20 years have failed to arrive at an international meaningful policy? There have been different theoretical perspectives that have been aimed at explaining those, and in my book I characterize them under three big categories. Those are like the rationalists, the constructivists, and the complexity and network theorists. The rationalists, for example, the Eleanor Ostrom's institutional analysis and development framework, which is also partially derived from the game theory, but the game theoreticians have modeled this international climate policy as a standard tragedy of commons, prisoner's dilemma game, where the countries which have the incentive to not cooperate in any way will not cooperate till the time they are incentivized to do so. So it's like a question of how do you change the incentive? Now, since there is no international government, so there is no incentive changing mechanisms, it has to be a bottom-up kind of incentive change that need to happen. And I think that's where this analysis somehow informs that we need to think about changing the incentives for the powerful GHG polluters in some way, but then they break down as well. Like what would be, like the outcome of that? There is also a problem with the institutional analysis and game theoretical approaches. They get into the first mover and late mover advantage issues. So they have found that the most polluting countries, it will be best for them to have to move the late not at the first, rather at the latest. So the country that makes the least move to make any pledge would have the late mover advantage in terms of gaining more in this bargain that's going on between the industrialized and industrializing countries. So this approach has kind of like deadlocked us into not finding any meaningful solutions except for doom and gloom kind of scenarios. On the other hand, the constructivist like policy design theory like that has roots in Herbert Simon's work and Schneider and Ingram, and also policy regime theory, Oren Young's work that has lately influenced my thinking a lot about the design of international institutions. They argue that it doesn't have to be a top-down kind of approach that we must follow. It could be bottom-up approach, but at the same time, there could be some multiple regimes that can exist at multiple levels of governance. So, for example, there could be an international like pledge and review system that could exist, but at the same time, there could be national level commitments as well as sub-national level, like the cities movement, smart cities growth movement, or these other kind of local governance initiatives, like ICLEI movement that's going on, and some of these other sub-national governance movements. They can play, so they lead to this idea of like polycentric governance, which is somehow interestingly, Eleanor Ostrom, just before she passed away, has published few articles about polycentric governance. So there was some convergence that was happening between these two theoretical strands, but there are some outstanding challenges, like what would be the nature of the polycentric governance? Which institutional levels would dominate in terms of the discussion, whether it would be the local cities that would take more initiative, meaningful initiative in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, or whether it would be still the UN level issues. Then finally, the complexity and network theories, they have the work that I've done with Chris Kaliba here, and in terms of our governance network framework, there was a 2010 book that came out. In that theory essentially looks at the democratic anchorage that is absent or present in these different kinds of governance networks. That's one way to look at it. But also it looks at it how different forms of capital flow through the system, that natural capital, human capital, financial capital, cultural capital, and how do these governance networks are organized or self-organized to deal with these problems as these problems become more and more challenging. So this is a very, we haven't really applied it, except there were a couple of papers about the accountability issues that I address in the book, and I don't have the time right now to get into it. But our main conclusion was that we need to have democratic global governance to improve this and have a decentralized approach. So, in the book, I have talked about these issues from three so-called like integrated policy analytical lenses. There's the politics of scale, politics of ideology, and politics of knowledge. And I'll try to be very quickly. Politics of scale refers to this idea that goes back to some of the literature in political ecology, human ecology, as well as social ecological systems, is that there are these the levels of governance, the way that governance action is taken. It is not always that all the levels of governance have equal amount of power. So, for example, if you look at the 400 years of colonization, like for example, that has resulted in massive amount of exploitation of natural resources in tropical countries or in Africa, about which I've spoken earlier here. We find that the larger scale entities govern the dynamics at the local scale or the national scale. So from the politics of scale, I mean that when there is disparity, there is power asymmetry between different levels of governance. So where larger scale, like global corporate systems, can influence the dynamics of local communities. So that's what we are observing, for example, in the case of tropical deforestation, which I've studied extensively in many developing countries. Politics of ideology refers to the idea that when there is certain ideology, certain forms of ideology that dominate the discussion of the policy and the governance design that emerges. So, like for example, free market capitalism. That is one example of the ideology that is considered as a solution to every problem. Similarly, politics of knowledge refers to like Western knowledge versus indigenous knowledge, like whose knowledge gets represented. And in climate change negotiations, many indigenous communities have argued that their indigenous knowledge should be made part of that international treaty language, but so far the Western people have resisted, those nations have resisted even the inclusion of that language, indigenous knowledge, that phrase, to be included in the treaty. So just quickly going through the politics of scale issues, for example, you know that many of these greenhouse gas emissions stay in the atmosphere for a very, very long time. So CO2, for example, stays in the atmosphere for about anywhere from 1,000 to 1,200 years. Versus methane, which is more potent greenhouse gas emission, but it dissolves in about 12 to 15 years. So if you're looking at 1,000-year residency times of these greenhouse gas emissions, we cannot look at it from just the annualized perspective. No matter which IPCC or other forms, the Western forms of knowledge that you see with respect to these treaty negotiations, you would see that they're typically represented as annualized emissions. So this is like annualized greenhouse gas emissions for developed countries, Annex 1 countries, that they have submitted. And these might not be the accurate numbers, but this is what the countries have represented. And you would see that US here is this graph, which is about, and these other countries, I've broken them down, and you would see that if we compare them, the scale issue is that here the scale is on this axis is about the teragrams of CO2 equivalent, which is like about billions of tons, and you would see that it's millions of tons on this axis. So this is about 5 billion tons that CO2 is emitting. But when we look at it from the cumulative perspective, since the residency time of these greenhouse gas emissions is such a long time, if we start that from 1750, I'm just here starting from 1990, this is the cumulative scale, and the scale here is very different. You would see that this is about, it's also in teragrams, so and this is also in teragrams, you would see that this is 5,000, 10,000, this is versus, this is 100,000, 200,000. So if you take into account the cumulative emissions and then allocate based on per capita emissions, figure out some kind of like graduation and deepening or per capita principle that looks at the cumulative emissions starting from 1750 till about our end goal, policy end horizon, let's say 2050. That is the end horizon of the 2020 long-term agreement that is being negotiated. So if we take that time horizon between 1750 to 2050, that's about 300 years. That would be the more accurate way that the developing countries are arguing that we need to allocate the emissions and then estimate that. But problem is that the developed countries, especially US and Australia and Canada, have argued that we cannot accommodate larger populations of countries like China and India. So they do not agree with this per capita principle. Per capita allocation principle has been contested on the grounds that the population is also a major factor, contributing factor of this, and we cannot accommodate larger population sizes. So this debate has been deadlocked since on this argument for such a long time, and that's what I call like the politics of scale issue here, is that who is given how much, like there are equity issues, there are access issues to the atmosphere as a commons, global commons, and there are also issues of like how do you estimate that? So the knowledge that is typically with respect to politics of knowledge as well, which is intertwined with this issue, is that the one form of knowledge, which is the annualized emissions, are given more prominence in the literature versus the cumulative emissions, which my argument is should be made more prominent in terms of allocation of greenhouse gas emissions. Similarly, if you look at the per capita emissions, like the variation within the annexed countries is also very high. So not all industrialized countries are equally responsible. So some countries have like 20 tons per capita, versus others have more like 5 to 10 per capita. And this is like an average of the 20-year period. But if you look at this over the average between 1750 and 2150, based on some allocation models, you can see that that average could also be used as a way to allocate these emissions. And in the book, I also have a global model that looks at the allocation for 120 countries, that if we switch from grandfathering to per capita, what would be the bargaining space for each country that will need to be decided and allocated in terms of the difference between grandfathering-based targets versus per capita-based allocations. So the challenge that we are left with, essentially, is that there is I call it like a dual challenge. The dual challenge is that on the one hand, we have very, very highly industrialized countries with per capita income of about $20,000 and above, which also have very high per capita CO2 emissions, like anywhere from 20 to 20. So this quadrant here, the people who are above, the countries which are above this line and this line here, they will need to figure out how to reduce their carbon footprint from 25 tons to about 2 or 3 tons by 2050. That's the bottom line target. Per person. Per person, yeah. So versus the developing countries which are below $5,000 per capita income, they will need to, once they're developing, they can follow this business as usual path or more like a leapfrogging path. And the question is, how would they leapfrog? Whether they would leapfrog. What kind of technological transfer would happen? So when the Kyoto Protocol flexibility mechanisms were designed, CDM was one of the flexibility mechanisms that was aimed at facilitating that leapfrogging for the developing countries. But that has not happened successfully. And I review probably 200 plus articles that have evaluated CDM in the book that look at how effective CDM has been. And CDM has not been able to, has fared very poorly in terms of facilitating leapfrogging so far. So that's my conclusion, and you can look at the details in the book. So in terms of politics of ideology, I looked at the sources of like, why do we have these politics of ideology? And we test this hypothesis in one of the papers that came out in Public Understanding of Science. And that has been retested now about 10 different times, and they've confirmed the same model that we produced. And our hypothesis was that even college education cannot trump the ideology. People who are ideologically predisposed to misunderstanding climate change, they will do so even if they are college educated. And that hypothesis has been tested many times. So we produced a very complex cultural model of the respondents that has been subjected to tested. So this is based on some survey data from California, where these are the correlations between different variables. And what we found was that when critical ideology, or when somebody has Republican or somebody is religious conservative, because they have very strong correlations, their concern for terrorism would be very high, but their concern for climate change would be very low. And this kind of research has been done in larger public opinion survey polls data as well. Recently I did Vermont poll in 2010 and 2012, and I'm not presenting the results here, but I find the same thing. Here we have a little bit more, not only Democratic and Republican Party, but also Progressive Party, which is a little bit more on the extreme side. In terms of the politics of knowledge, there are about 2 chapters, and I'll just try to be very quick about it, is that there is this idea that the flexibility mechanisms privileged cap and trade discussion. So RED plus, CDM, joint implementation mechanisms, they were based on the cap and trade idea, but cap and trade means a lot of challenges in terms of identifying the allocations, in terms of they have very high transaction costs. The EU cap and trade market has more or less collapsed since the Great Recession. There are some hopeful signs the Chinese and Australians are coming up with their cap and trade markets, and they might be trying to link them with the EU market. And California is also initiating their cap and trade market. But overall, I think the cap and trade mechanism, my conclusion in this book is that it's not going to work out. We need to have more direct institutional changes, for example, in the international trading regime, as well as in the international, the international carbon taxes might be more effective, and they will have less carbon, less transaction cost versus the cap and trade mechanism. And I get into all the details where studies have tried to estimate the transaction cost. And I think that the transaction cost of cap and trade is very high because, for example, for CDM, we have created essentially a new bureaucracy that is measuring and monitoring these CDM projects, and the developing countries struggle with having their legitimate projects be accepted and funded while all these corporations are able to successfully hire very high-flown consultants, and they can have their RED projects and CDM projects approved in a month, while the legitimate projects can take years to be even on their radar screen.
And just one quick comment that there's, you can have a cap and auction or a cap and trade is one mechanism. Offsets is a separate issue, because you could have cap and trade with no offsets, in which case all of that, so you could essentially have cap and trade or cap and auction where the revenue goes to complementary sequestration rather than substitute.
Right. I agree with that. I mean, so there is that issue that, I mean, they could coexist in some form or across different sectors. If you look at the sectoral approach, in some sectors you can have cap and trade or offset approach, but in other sectors you might need to have carbon taxes, like transportation needs taxes badly. So I mean, I think, there are these issues that I get into a lot of details, and I already briefly mentioned about the anchored global governance, and I'll say a little bit more about it just before closing down. I think that this is a planetary scale issue, and one of this community has emerged, it's the Earth System Governance that I've been engaged since last 3-4 years. They say that planetary scale governance requires planetary scale institutions, but we don't have planetary scale institutions at this point. But we have UN, which is basically promoting globalization-based systems. What they're doing is, if you look at the UNFCCC is not even represented here, which is the UN Framework for Climate Change, Convention for Climate Change. And if you look at all the agencies if you look at the funding flows, that goes back to the governance network analysis that we've been looking at, the funding flows that are flowing through these agencies, you would see that WTO or these UNDP or these other agencies are primarily given a lot more money to exercise economic development and promote globalization. But the agencies which are promoting conservation or energy conservation, energy efficiency, or renewable energy, they're not given as much money. So there is that funding issues that we are trying to study at this point in a little bit more depth. And there are also, from the governance perspective, the UN Security Council still represents the world order that was established in Second World War, post-Second World War, so we need to change that idea. And some of the global governance options that are being discussed in this community is whether we need a global parliament, or we need to just modify the existing UN system, like say, for example, expand the UN Security Council or give more voting authority to the UN General Assembly as well as International Court of Justice. Or we continue with the weak Bretton Woods system that we have. So I will conclude with a few pages of reading that are my summing thoughts from the book, and then we can have questions. So this is from my final chapter. It's called Governing Environmental Complexity. So I've argued that the phases of coupled human natural systems could not be predefined to scientifically manage human-induced global climate change. Instead, I have argued that a complex systems-based, adaptive, decentralized, and democratically anchored governance of coupled human and natural systems could be used as guideposts to adequately cope with global environmental and social crises. Normative underpinnings of governing complexity, informed by complex systems-based understanding of global climate change, global biodiversity loss, and global food insecurity, could guide us towards adaptive governance-based interventions in local to global communities. In turn, this could create room for open-ended and value-laden adaptive governance strategies to cope with global climate change, global food and biodiversity loss, and other such problems. Iterative nature of adaptive risk governance could also provide opportunities to the local managers of complex systems to use creative problem-solving skills based upon the community values and the constantly evolving knowledge of the partially unknowable, adjacent possible states of coupled human and natural systems that could be dynamically managed with the evolving knowledge of adjacent possible states contain both intended and unintended consequences. At the global scale, these normative underpinnings for a post-Kyoto climate governance regime carry important ethical and legal implications. In the midst of unmitigated or even partially mitigated human-induced climate change, human civilization is witnessing perhaps the greatest crime that continues to be perpetrated by powerful industrialized nations since 1750, and now closely followed by rapidly industrialized countries through the fossil fuel-driven development path discussed earlier in this book. Even if we hit a Hubbard's peak for oil in the 21st century, the availability of technologically recoverable coal and natural gas for the next 300 to 500 years will certainly condemn the present human civilization as we know it, literally and figuratively, to the hell. This condemnation will spare neither the rich industrialized countries not the poor industrializing countries. While the Newtonian system of the world which brought industrial revolution to the present human civilization might have engendered an illusion of control by human systems over the natural systems, the sheer complexity of the natural system's response to a quadrupling of CO2 emissions 100 years from today is simply unfathomable, much less controllable. The human understanding of climate change impacts under tripling or quadrupling of CO2 emissions above the pre-industrial levels is rather poor and perhaps beyond our cognitive reach. The non-linearities in the response of natural systems, which could include widespread floods, droughts, heat waves, and storms, could play havoc with agricultural and ecological systems that provide constitutive support to life systems on this planet. The critical transitions in the phase spaces of atmospheric system that regulates weather patterns on this planet are very hard to predict, yet these phase transitions will take place if human civilization continues on the business as usual path of tripling or even quadrupling CO2 emissions above the pre-industrial levels. Lack of policy action at the global scale on mitigation and adaptation to global climate change, which cascades down to national and local scales, carries the potential for this planet to move on a trajectory of post-human world. This trajectory does not have to be inevitable. The human civilization contains the seeds for intelligence and normative actions, which could trigger ethical, legal, and institutional changes away from the business as usual development trajectories. Early warning signals through widespread droughts, more intense tropical storms, and unbearable heat waves could perhaps lead to widespread distress and suffering, which in turn could induce an institutional response to deal with global climate change. Will it be too late then? Giddens called it, this is Anthony Giddens, called it Giddens' paradox. It states that since the dangers posed by global warming aren't tangible, immediate, or visible in the course of day-to-day life, however awesome they appear, many will sit on their hands and do nothing of a concrete nature about them. Yet waiting until they become visible and acute before being stirred to action will by definition be too late. So this is, the Giddens paradox is what we are facing at this point of time. And the question is, like I ask you, to participate in this discussion, where do we go from here? Like whether the path that we are on will help us save, or whether should we just wait and see, or do we need to take some proactive action, or do you think like we just do nothing? So this is the question that I'm posing in terms of these different options that we put on the table. Thank you. Stephanie.
Thanks, Asim, wonderful talk. I look forward to reading your book. It seems like all these ideas can only go forward if they have champions or leaders. So I'm wondering what your read of the leadership landscape is. Who's having any success at either the kind of country level or significant individuals? Because otherwise it just looks so frozen. So who's moving?
That's a good question. I think that's probably the serious paradox that we're facing in terms of like one of the simulation games that I do in my class with the students. We're looking at these climate policy negotiations, simulation game. One of the things that we do is like make the developing countries sit on the floor while the representatives of the developed countries sit on the chairs. And there is food that is served, and the food is only available for the countries, representatives of the developed countries. So we are facing, that's what I also call like the politics of knowledge problem here, is that the countries who are the emitters, they are in such powerful position in the negotiations that they are championing the ideas like bottom-up national commitments or pledge and review system, which is even non-binding, which is in this category. So they are in more powerful position to impose their discourse in terms of the treaty, and I have like looked at these UNFCCC-driven treaties, the agreements that have been signed every year, and most of the language is same every year. It has that flexibility mechanism, cap and trade, stamp on it, and I think so. The other ideas, there are ideas that have been proposed by like say countries like Brazil have championed certain ideas, or Indians have. I mean, India has from the very beginning argued for per capita emissions since 1990 actually. The person who wrote that in 1990, the book, I met her in Doha, and she mentioned that they are now going to write another book called Carbon Capitalism. I mean, because they wrote an article earlier on, and now it's like basically, like the carbon imperialism essentially. That's what's going on. So it's very challenging for these smaller countries to say. And then AOSIS, Alliance of Island States, have been a little bit more vocal, and they have been proposing more stringent grandfathering-based or per capita-based targets, or even ability to pay-based principles that have come out of some of the Eastern European bloc. But I think it's again, the problem is that those options are not even discussed in the during the negotiations, essentially because they are not in a powerful position to even bring these on the agenda, on the formal agenda. Of course, you can talk about these in the side events. Nobody listens to them. Josh?
And just really quickly, I want to say that a lot of these models on climate change, like the Stern Review and all these others, Stern actually says, we could expect 5% decrease in GDP, but worst case scenario, maybe 20% if we value ecosystem services and everything. But all of these models assume endless economic growth. So by 2050, we'd have a worst case scenario, 20% reduction in our GDP, but the GDP will be 3 to 4 times what it is now.
Yeah.
So when he says we should sacrifice 1% of our GDP to reduce the damage to the future, he's saying we should sacrifice for richer future generations, which also doesn't make much sense.
Yeah.
He says explicitly, Stern says, that if we spend 1% on GDP, we could reduce the risk of catastrophe to 29%. He says that means we'd have to accept our standard of living from 4 to 5 months ago, meaning in 2050, we'd have to accept our standard of living from 2049 and a half. He says we could reduce the chance of catastrophe to 6% by spending 1.8% of GDP, but that would be an unacceptably high cost. But if you go, he doesn't say this explicitly. He does say explicitly 4 to 5 months reduction is 1% GDP, 1% of GDP. But what he's saying is that it would be unacceptable to accept our living standards from like last July in order to prevent these catastrophes. And he says what the catastrophes are. Nordhaus agrees what the catastrophes are. Nordhaus says it would be unacceptable to accept our living standards from 4 to 5 months ago to prevent those catastrophes. Because this obsession with growth, the assumption of growth means we don't need to do anything because the future will be richer and can better handle it. And the obsession with growth means that we shouldn't do anything because it's going to threaten that. And you can't come up with,
Right, I agree. That's the question. It's like which paradigm of growth would govern the development of the developing countries in the next 50 years? I think that's going to be the decider. Because the developed countries have already attained, they are already in post-industrialized phase. And the best hope was under the Kyoto Treaty that the way it was framed was that maybe this flexibility mechanism would help transfer some wealth and technical knowledge from industrialized countries, and they might be willing to share that technical knowledge of say solar technologies and wind turbines with the developing countries, so that developing countries don't have to necessarily follow the same fossil fuel intensive path. But I think that didn't materialize the way it was anticipated, first of all. I mean, if you look at the actual CDM projects, that database is available on CDM website, you would see that majority of those projects were concentrated in cement sector, and they took place either in China or India, with the cement industry. And a couple of my colleagues, like Nathan Hulteman in Maryland, he actually visited those project sites, and he found that these companies were essentially taking their existing plants, moving them, and taking the money for CDM money for the new project to install, like say, new thermal efficiency control systems or some other kind of systems that would reduce the emissions. But those were the mitigation approaches that were envisioned in theory didn't work out. So on the other hand, when we go into these larger scale issues, like when we look at like the expected costs versus expected benefits of taking action versus not taking action, and there have been World Resources Institute, for example, follows sectoral approach, and they have under the sectoral approach they have calculated expected damages and expected benefits of taking action or a range of actions for each sector. And I would highly recommend those, if you want to get into those numbers. And they're using competitive equilibrium models to estimate those numbers, which I think are much more relatively better. They have better uncertainty quantifiers around them than Norgaard's models. I'm sorry, and I have a lot of respect for Norgaard. His multi-generation overlapping model. Right, but I think it has some assumptions about the future growth that are very, very problematic. And I think that the question is like for the countries which are already developed, what would be their development pattern, whether they would maintain the current forms of consumption and in which form, and how they would be, like say, the food consumption as well as energy consumption are the major contributors, and energy includes both building as well as the transportation sectors. I think we need to make major transformation in our building, transportation, and food system if we want to reduce per capita carbon footprint from 25 tons to about 2 tons. That should be our goal, but the question is how? And we can look into all of those sectors, but that's where the problem is. I saw Matt and then Taylor.
So I guess my question, does democracy solve this problem? Even if we had this world where you had the senators from each country and population-based representative, you still, who is your world arbiter?
Yeah. So there are two thoughts there. One is about having a global parliament that would, there would be certain accountability at the global scale, where if that global parliament, like the countries which are being, which would be affected, or the communities even in the developed countries which would start to be affected by global climate change induced events, like tropical storm Sandy, or I've looked at like 110 years of hurricane data, and there have been like some studies about like how can you tease out the effect of climate change from the non-climate change events. So I'm kind of like looking into those issues. And I think it's really, you can attribute these weather events and some of these other kinds of events to climate change. But within developed countries, that change of perception can change whatever happens at the global scale if we have a global parliament. So I think it's going to be it's going to be one option that need to be explored. But I presented this idea in ASPA conference last week in New Orleans, and one of the political scientists from Norway asked me that why do we need to create a global parliament just for dealing with climate change problem? And I said, well, this is not my position. My position is that we need to have democratically anchored global governance no matter what. So if we are dealing with planetary scale crisis, increasingly not only in the environmental domain, but also in financial domain. Like with the financial crisis, there were many culprits there with the 2008 financial crisis. And those financial banks basically played havoc with people's fortunes. Countries like Spain and Greece, and people are suffering there. There's like 40+% unemployment rate. So, but there has been no accountability at the international scale. These banks are still doing it. So it's like a question of, for the global scale governance, when we study that, and there is no democratic governance, it's basically the UN system that I presented here. We need to have certain form of accountability at the global scale, and I don't see any other way other than have a democratic global. So now the question is like the how part. How part, it could be through either directly the government, like a new institution, or we could expand the powers of the UN General Assembly. So like an incrementalist solution versus kind of a little bit more non-incrementalist solution. That's where the debate is. So Frank Bierman recently published a paper in Science a few months ago saying that incremental solutions don't work. We need to have, will not work to deal with the climate change problem. We need to have, or biodiversity loss problem, which is like massive, which is worse than the climate change. So we need to have certain democratically anchored global governance, not only for environmental issues, but also for other policy domains.
Yeah, I had a question kind of on the opposite end of that. So I thought I heard you say that the world is going from the upper left of your chart that's up there now to the bottom left.
Yeah.
And that bottom left is kind of an area that's contemplated and supported by network governance theory and the kinds of So the thing I don't understand about how that could possibly work is where the incentives are, as you keep bringing up, to put in place a regional cap and trade or a regional or sub-national effort to reduce emissions, right? So you're saying it would be a patchwork of lots of sub-global things that network theory might predict could actually solve the problem in the absence of a global parliament. I don't get how that could be, because I don't see what the incentive is to not free ride.
Right, and that's exactly the conclusion of the game theoreticians and the institutional.
Regionally.
I mean, right, exactly.
Why would some region of India...
That is not expected to happen, and as I showed you in the model, that's clear that...
So is it a viable option at all?
No, I mean it's not, because if you look at...
that.
I mean, that's where we are, I mean, at this point. But if the model that I showed you, I mean, these are the confirmed like proposals, the pledges.
Yeah.
But if we go down, like even the potential proposals can be there, which could help a lot. But we really need to be on this path to if we want to get to
And a
this.
governance network of sub-global things would never get us to the LE path.
I mean, at least that's the current understanding under the current incentive position pledges that we have. But I mean, whether it would change, whether there could be some game-changing events. So let's say, I don't want to present like doom and gloom scenarios, but if the drought can lead to primarily anywhere from 1 billion to 1.5 billion people going hungry on this planet by 2020, 2030, I'm looking into the migration issues that I spoke about recently. The climate refugees, the estimates are anywhere from 50 million to 500 million at this point of time. But some of the IPCC fifth assessment report, the drafts that I've seen, they could be anywhere, they're even larger numbers, because when you interact these food insecurity challenges and the drought, people are not able to, for example, raise their animals in Africa. Because if there is no water, they can't live, right? And you've worked in Africa, it's like the Sudan is the perfect living example of that. The drought kicked in northern Sudan, people migrated to the south, southern people are already sitting on the oil, they started to fight with each other. So then there has been like more or less a permanent migration that's happened there. Similarly, we're looking in other Sahel regions like Chad and Mali, similar phenomena is rolling out. So in the form of those, like if we have those crises that come up, and that can trigger change in the perceptions of major greenhouse gas emitters like US, like that there was some talk about it, like say in the case of after Katrina or after Sandy, or after this drought. But other than that, I don't see any major incentive change in this quadrant, here or here even. So it's not going to be. It's not going to be self-motivating, and that's part of the Gibbons paradox. Is that by the time they become cognizant of the risk, it might be too late because we might have already crossed the threshold because of the lagged effect. So the carbon dioxide that was emitted in 1850 is now playing havoc. The molecules that we're emitting now would become part of that global. So I mean, the residency time and the lagged effects in the atmospheric system is going to play a little bit of a game with human cognition here. I think so.
So one thing I struggle with is a dynamic. I don't know if it's fully represented in the talk thus far. We have economic system based on growth. That economic growth is to a large extent tied to energy consumption, and you get some little changes in energy intensity here and there, but they haven't been very large in most places. And so that growth and that energy is all sustaining a monetary system. That if that growth doesn't happen, that monetary system collapses. And we saw it in 2008. You have a little dip in growth, 1-2%, monetary system falls apart. So can we address a lot of the larger kind of governance issues without addressing the fact that we've got every developed country in the world on the fiscal cliff and our monetary system kind of dissolving beneath our feet?
Okay, so I think there is a fallacy here to think, if you think a little bit, that more GDP, when we look at the GDP per capita numbers, right, that's economic growth numbers. GDP per capita, when you take it, you have to not only look at the average and its spread, you also have to look at, if you look at the Gini coefficient that's associated with that, you would see the distribution of that. You would see that 5% of the people have access to about 20% of the wealth. And 80% of the people have access to about 20% of the wealth. And then the rest of them are in the middle. It's like, it's very kind of like skewed distribution that we're looking at. So when you think about changing, like doing these policy interventions, that is not necessarily going to lead to, like carbon tax or international trade tax is not necessarily going to diminish per capita GDP. It's not going to lead to that. It's going to, what it will have, it will spur innovation in other sectors. So we would be, eventually, if you look at the longer time horizon, we would replace coal-fired power plants with solar and wind. We will replace natural gas with other technologies over a longer period of time. So you're looking at technological substitution effects when you introduce the policy interventions to regulate certain pollutants. And I think that does not mean that the wealth would go down. So that's my one part of the question answer. Second is that I think these like 2008 recession, these kind of events, if you look at the real world business cycle theory, these kind of changes happen. They're bound to happen because we're dealing with stochastic systems. The wealth goes up and down on annual, sometimes on 5-yearly cycle. Those cycles change. So when it goes down, we don't need to be concerned too much about it because the people who have caused that risk and the bubble that arises in the system eventually fades out and those firms are replaced. Now, sometimes governments can kick in and try to save those firms, which caused the problem, like 2008 bailout, or they can let those firms fade into oblivion. That also happens many times. And I think I think we need to be not too much concerned about like those smaller bubbles and smaller ups and downs. It's rather looking at the long-term picture. I think we need to think about how we can generate the development vision that we want to have without adversely affecting the environment. So I mean that's the transformation that we need is more important in terms of our development vision, like whether we are living in a developing country or developed world versus just doing bean counting of these per capita GDP numbers.